Hello, everyone, and welcome to the United Nations University Institute for Water, Environment, and Health's Science Talk series in this, our 30th anniversary year. My name is Dr. Rohit Ramchandani, UNU-INWEH's Innovation and Strategic Partnerships Officer, and I'm delighted to be your host for today's Science Talk. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, our Science Talk they showcase the diverse, policy-relevant, and interdisciplinary research of UNU-INWEH and our global network of experts. These sessions are designed not only to share cutting-edge science, but also to explore how that science translates into real-world solutions for water, environment, and health challenges around the globe. Today's session, like all of our talks, oh, sorry, you know what, I'm just gonna fix this so we can see Dr. Sadek on the screen here. Today's session, like all of our talks, is being recorded. This video will be made available in an open access format following the event, and you can find recordings of all of our previous science talks on demand via our website and YouTube channel at unu.edu/INWEH/science-talks. As always, we will conclude with an interactive Q&A session. So please feel free to post your questions in the chat at any point during the presentation, and we will address as many as possible towards the end of today's session. Today's science talk is entitled Predictive Understanding of Wildfire Ignitions Across the Western United States, Patterns of Interactions Among Factors that Govern Wildfire Ignitions. And it's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Mojtaba Sadek. Dr. Sadek's research is focused on using geospatial analysis, machine learning, statistical methods, and data, including from satellite imagery, to unravel mechanisms that drive climate extremes and their societal impacts. This encompasses a broad range of hydroclimatic extremes, including multi-hazard events and wildfires. At UNU-INWEH, Dr. Sadek serves as lead for climate and wildfire analytics, including the development of scientific, educational, and policy materials that facilitate mitigating and adapting to climate change and wildfires. Dr. Sadek is an associate professor of civil engineering at Boise State University in Idaho and is a recipient of the Golden Apple Award for Inclusive Teaching. With that, it's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Mojtaba Sadek. Moji, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ro. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I first want to start with it's been an honor being part of this community. I want to start with a couple of congratulations to you all. First of all, congrats for the 30th anniversary of UNU-INWEH. Congratulations on the water bankruptcy report, the landmark report that you all prepared. Congratulations, that was amazing. And last but not least, congratulations to the director of UNU-INWEH, Dr. Kaveh Madani, for receiving the Stockholm Water Prize. It's been an honor being part of this community. I'm looking forward to presenting my research to you all today. All right, I should have been on the first page. There we go. Just to confirm, you see my screen in full presentation mode, correct?
We do, yes.
Perfect. So we all know about the increasing wildfire problem across the world. Specifically in the Western US, we have observed an escalation of wildfire activity. This graph shows the forest fire area across the Western US from 1980s all the way to 2020, and as you can see, it's increasing. But what's even more alarming is that we don't really expect a decline in the burned area into the future. At least by the mid-century, we expect the burned area to continue to rise. And it's not just the burned area, the number of people exposed to fire is also increasing. Across the contiguous US, the number of people exposed to fire in the past 2 decades more than doubled. Across the West, that was even more pronounced. Across the Western US, the rate of increase was even more, with the number of people exposing to fire more than nearly tripled in the Western US. In the Eastern US, the rate of exposure to fire was roughly constant, with a little bit of a decline, but that is expected to change with the drying, with the increasing dry spells that we see in the Eastern US. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on the background. I want to just jump into what we can do about these wildfires. You all know the problem that we have with the wildfires. Now, let's have a look at the fire triangle. What does a fire need to grow? It needs oxygen. We can't really do much about the oxygen. You can think of this as winds being part of this, but nevertheless, oxygen itself. We need a source of ignition and we need fuels. Now, we cannot control oxygen, but we can control the ignitions, and to some extent, we can manipulate fuels. Now, manipulation of fuels is going to be very expensive, so it's very effective if we just focus on reducing the number of ignitions. Let me just quickly make this a pointer. So if we focus on the ignitions, that's going to be a lot more cheaper and probably more effective. And I say that because 84% of all fire ignitions across the United States are human started. What you see here, each hexagon shows the number of ignitions in a 0.5 degree cell across the United States. What you see in color, the more red it is, the more of those fires are human started. So you can see in the Eastern US, a lot of these fires are human started. In the interior Western US, a lot of them become lightning ignitions, but still a lot of human ignitions as well. In Idaho, where I am, it's 50-50. But where the population live, where majority of the population live in the Western US, we have majority of the fires being human started. Not only that, human-started fires are more destructive. If you look at the area burned, and if you just focus in California, human-started fire account for about 56% of burned areas for these large mega fires, not for all fires. Nevertheless, for the mega fires, 56% human-started, 44% natural started. But when we look at the impacts on humans, the number of structures destroyed and the number of fatalities caused, we see about 90% of the structures destroyed and 90% of the fatalities caused were actually driven by human-started fires. This red is showing human-started, the blue is showing naturally started fires. So if we can prevent those human-started fires, we can prevent many of these destructive fires as well. Toward that goal, we need to predict when and where human ignitions of fires may happen to be able to target our prevention strategies. Now, luckily, there is temporal and spatial structure in human ignitions of fires. If we look at this graph, this is for the entire United States. The red is showing the human-started fires, and the blue is showing naturally or lightning-started fires. Well, we see the peak, that the highest number of ignitions across the US happen on 4th of July, and that's when the Independence Day in the US is. A lot of people are celebrating with fireworks and they're starting fires. There is spring fires associated with debris burn and other things. When we focus on naturally started fires, we see that a lot of them are focused in summer. So there is some temporal structure there. And if we look at specific ecoregions across the Western US, if we get down to each of these ecoregions separately, we see that temporal structure is even more pronounced. So there is that. There is also spatial structure in wildfire ignitions in general, and specifically in human ignitions of wildfires. Now, if you look at where the human ignitions are, where the population is, obviously, in the West specifically, these are all roads. So these are all major roads in the Western US, and you can see the ignitions are following major roads and major populations or sparse population centers. So there is a spatial structure also in wildfire ignitions that we can use to make a predictive model. So with that in mind, we try to capture those spatial and temporal structures through a variety of attributes that I will talk about in the next slides. And then we ran them through a machine learning model to give us for each point what's the probability of having an ignition or not, and then that will give us a ignition probability map across the Western US. Basically, this is the framework that I will be talking about today. Now, first step to develop that framework is we need wildfire ignition data, and we need to capture those spatial and temporal structures. So we need to capture the structure, this spatial and temporal structure, through a variety of attributes. So we developed the FPA-FOD fire program analysis fire occurrence database attributes, fire occurrence database attributes dataset, which basically adds more than 300 attributes to more than 2.3 million fire incidents across the United States. The attributes include weather and climate. We know that, for example, hotter and drier weather is more conducive to fire ignition, so weather is super important. Climate is also important because if a region is too dry, we probably don't have enough fuel to have an ignition or a fire. And if the region is too wet, it's probably not going to be conducive to fires anyway, at least to frequent fires. Another category of variables that are important is land cover and topography. Specifically with topography, a lot of these lightning fire ignitions are higher in the elevations. A lot of the human ignitions are lower in the elevation. Land cover is also super important. Grasses are obviously a lot more conducive or a lot more receptive to ignitions compared to conifer forests. And conifer forest is probably a little more conducive to large fires than deciduous or aspen or other deciduous trees. Social factors are also very important. Population density specifically is very important, because where we have too much population, there is not enough fuel to burn, and where we have too little population, there's not enough people to start fires. Global Human Modification Index is another factor that's super important. This is capturing the changes that humans made on the environment. So this is basically where population is, where infrastructure is, and where human presence in general exists. So that basically, that human presence is important for starting those fires. There's also administrative factors. We included, for example, the national preparedness level in our data set. The national preparedness level basically ranges from 1 to 5. 5 means that there are many large fires occurring across the United States, and the resources available for suppressing fires is very limited. So basically that shows the fire activity and the amount of resources available for fire suppression and also fire prevention, because if you're directing all your resources to fire suppression, it means there's not enough resources for fire prevention. Nevertheless, the data set that we have, and this is publicly available through this paper that I cited here, we have 2.3 million fires, and we have 300 attributes associated with the day and location of ignition that we assigned to each of those fires that can be used in a predictive model. Now, out of those 307 attributes that we have in this FPA-FOD dataset, 124 of them are predictive. The rest of them can be used for descriptive analysis. They're not necessarily predictive. Then we did a correlation analysis, and also based on our physical understanding of what are the factors that drive fire ignitions, we came down with a list of 28 factors or 28 attributes that are less correlated. It's not that they're not correlated. There's many of them are correlated, but they're capturing different processes or different scale of processes. So we needed to include them anyway. But we tried to capture the attributes that are informative but have least correlation in our predictive model. Those attributes include, we have date and location. Day of year, for example, is important. That captures the seasonality of fires. For example, that 4th of July, US Independence Day is important for certain fires. For example, for debris burn fires, these are specifically for agricultural fires. These are the two tail of the growing season. So spring and late fall, or fall is when the debris fires mostly happen. So they're important. Fire year, it's a proxy for some of the policies. We didn't really have a good data set of fire policies and fire prevention strategies, but basically we are using fire as a proxy to capture those trends in the data, because a lot of our fires, a lot of our annual number of fires are showing declining trends, and that's because a lot of those policies are important. FIPS code is another factor. This basically is showing which county the fire is happening in. That's basically the spatial signature of the fires. Weather and climate, I talked about before. Annual weather and annual precipitation, temperature, evapotranspiration. This is basically showing where the vegetation is or not, and how receptive that vegetation might be to ignition. Daily precipitation, temperature, wind, and also a variety of fire danger indices. This is showing individual in each day how dry and hot the day is and how receptive the fuels are to ignitions. Topography, I talked about before, elevation, aspect, slope. TPI is topographic position index, which shows basically whether it's on a hill or down in a valley. Land cover, we discussed before. Social factors, GDP is important. That basically, GDP to some extent is important here, because it shows where the wealthy versus less wealthy counties are, and that determines how much resources available, for example, for trash collection or other things that may have an impact on certain types of fires. Global Human Modification Index I talked about, and other things. Management, protected status area, for example, some of these areas are not open to hunting. And with them not being open to hunting, we don't have a lot of those recreation fires that happen elsewhere. A national preparedness level I talked about before. So these are basically attributes that we use in that predictive model. All this data that I talked about is available on this website, fpafod.boisestate.edu. So please have a look, download the data, or visualize the data as you wish. It's a good resource. At least, this is just for the United States, but nevertheless, it provides some important insights about wildfire ignitions and growth and other things. Now, with all of that in mind, our data, our fire data, fire ignition data, range from 1992 to 2020. For 1992 to 2000, we do not have the population data. So that's an important factor. Not having it is going to cause some issues. So we did not include these fires in our predictive models. 2000 to 2018, we have about 500,000 fire incidents across the Western US. We broke them down into 65% train, 15% validation, 20% test for our models. And we kept 2019 and 2020 entirely out of all model training. So those two years basically act as extra test for validation of our models. That's in addition to the test data that we have from 2000 to 2018. I talked a lot about where the fires happen, but to have a predictive model of fire probability, not only we need fire presence samples, we also need fire absence samples. To create those fire absence samples, we took a couple of different routes. One is hypersampling. This is what majority of the literature is using. Basically, you're selecting days and locations in which the fire did not happen, which are many, right? What we did here, we broke down the entire Western US into 4-kilometer grids. In each grid, we sampled 9 different points, 4 days in summer, 2 days in fall, 2 days in spring, 1 day in winter. This is basically this distribution of fire ignitions that we have. This is now obviously the fire absence. And these days are distributed over the 21 years of our study from 2000 to 2020. So that gave us about 36 million absence of fire samples. That's one way to create fire absence samples. Another way is spatially stratified sampling. So this is basically telling us a fire happened today in the location that I am. The fire did not happen yesterday. The fire did not happen 2 weeks from now. The fire did not happen 5 years before, right? What we are trying to do is we are trying to capture the spatial signature here, but try to find what's the temporal signature of this day that ignition happened. So this is spatially stratified samples. For each point that there was an ignition, we took 9 dates that are not the date of ignition, distributed between 1992 and 2020, or 2000 to 2020. And then we also have temporally stratified sampling. So this is spatially stratified sampling. We call it SSS. So when I refer to it later, I'm referring to this spatially stratified samples, and then TSS, which is temporally stratified samples. At this location, at this day that the fire happened, on this very same day, the fire did not happen 4 kilometers away. The fire did not happen 15 kilometers away. So what is that spatial signature? Why is it that fire is happening in this location and not a couple of kilometers away from it? So basically, at the date of location, at the date of ignition, we sampled location randomly within 4 kilometers and within 15 kilometers, and we call them TSS 14 and TSS 15. Now, this all together give us more than 40 million fire absence samples. Now, if we look at the attributes associated with those fire presence and fire absence samples, the fire absence is showing with blue, the fire presence is showing with red. If you look at vapor pressure deficit, we know that higher vapor pressure deficit means higher aridity, so it's hotter and drier. And basically VPD is showing that, well, I mean, yes, with the fire ignition samples, we have hotter and drier weather compared to fire absence samples. We also have the dead fuel moisture. We see that the dead fuel moisture for fire absence is lower than the fire presence, so that's expected. We have the daily temperature. This is in Kelvin. We see that temperatures in the days that fire ignition happened is more than those that did not observe an ignition. But that aside, there are other factors that at least singularly are not showing much of a difference between fire absence and fire presence. So basically, a lot of these factors are working together, not alone, to determine where fires happen or not. Now, with what I have presented so far, with fire ignition samples and with fire absence samples, we developed 2 types of models. One is called ignition model. Ignition model is basically using the hyper sampling absence of ignition samples. So for the fire absence, we take just those randomly selected points. We also developed augmented ignition model. Augmented ignition model is basically taking those SSS and TSS data in addition to the hyper sampled fire absence data. So we have ignition model that's just randomly fed. We have augmented ignition model, which is basically intelligently fed with absence of fire samples, because fire sample is constant or similar between the 2 models. Let's see the model performance on the test data. So this is basically that 20% test data that I discussed. With the ignition model, we have quite a good precision and recall and accuracy. Accuracy is not a good metric here because this data is unbalanced. We have a lot of lack of or a lot of absence of fire. So accuracy is not the best factor, but precision and recall are showing a really good performance. Now, if we use that model, the ignition model, for those SSS, TSS4, and TSS15 to just to evaluate that model. The model should give us absence of fire, right? But the model is doing really poorly on that SSS, TSS 4 and TSS 15. The model is actually capturing a lot of those points as fires. And I want to remind you that these TSS and SSS data are very similar to the ignition points, right? So they are even at the same date, with a little farther away, or at the same location on a different date. So that they have a lot of those information that pushes model toward capturing that as an ignition. But if we give part of this to the model, and if we create this augmented ignition model, we see that for the test data, our model performance drop a little bit, not much, but the model actually does a fantastic job on those absence of ignition samples, SSS, TSS4, and TSS50. And if we evaluate this model on year 2019, which is basically entirely out of our period of training, we see the model is, doing more or less robust, very similar to what we had before. We have for 2019, but if we evaluate that model on year 2020, then the performance drops significantly. Look at the recall values, 23% and 21%. Now, what happened in 2020 was COVID, right? COVID was a societal shock. A lot of people were sent home, stay at home. A lot of people started to do some yard work. A lot of people started to do more recreation outside. Specifically with that yard work, a lot of debris burn fire happened. And also with stay at home and with all the work issues and all the worker shortages that were there, a lot of the fire prevention strategies, for example, vegetation clearing around communities did not happen in that year. And that basically caused one of the highest number of ignitions across the Western US. And we did another study. We noticed that the number of ignitions in 2020 cannot be explained by climate. So this was the societal shock. And that's why the model is not working on this, because the model has not really seen a societal shock like COVID-19. So we cannot really expect that model to perform good or perform really well in that specific year. Now, at this point, we have a point model, but we want to create these maps of ignition probability, right? How many points do we have on that map? Infinite. So to basically make it work, what we did was we tried to break the entire Western US into 4-kilometer grid and take the centroid of that grid and basically evaluate the model on the centroid and basically assign the probability of ignition to that entire grid point. We did it for 4 kilometers, then we did it with 1 kilometer, and then we did it for 250 meter, and then we did it with 30 meter. We wanted to evaluate what is the sensitivity of our model to basically finer and finer resolution grid sizes. With 4-kilometer grids, we are capturing 76% of all the fire ignitions. So 76% of all the fire ignitions are captured if we just go with the 4-kilometer grid size. And there are reasons for it. One of it is being whether it's super important for our model. 4-kilometer is the resolution of our weather model. So if you go smaller than 4-kilometer, the weather is not going to be different. It's just that it's just other factors like topography and others that are impacting. If you go from 4-kilometer to 1-kilometer grid size, the number of fires or the percentage of fires that we capture is 81%. So 76 to 81%. If you go to 250 meters, it goes to 83%. But keep in mind, as we go from 4-kilometer to 1-kilometer, we are increasing the number of the computational expense by 16 times. And if you go from 1-kilometer to 250, another 16 times. So 16 times 16 is the computation that goes from 4-kilometer to 250. Nevertheless, we decided that 1 kilometer is good enough. We just want to create the fire maps or fire ignition probability maps based on the 1 kilometer grid size. This is for a specific day, September 15, 2019, which we had 39 fires. This is one of the highest number of fires that we had during our period. This is showing the ignition model. This is showing the augmented ignition model, and the colors indicate the probability. So we have low, less than 25%, medium, between 25% to 50% probability, high, 50 to 75, and very high, 75% and more probability of an ignition. What we see with the ignition model is 100% of those 39 fires are captured. So that's a great find. But what we see here is that the entire Western US almost is shown with a very high fire ignition probability. That's not really informative, right? So we cannot really tell the fire managers that everywhere there is a high probability. The resources are limited. Obviously, we can have that very high probability everywhere. That's fine, but that's not informative. We cannot tell managers that, hey, send your resources to everywhere. That's not going to work. This augmented ignition model, on the other hand, is only capturing 82% of the predicted fires. So it's missing some of those fires. But it shows the variability in the fire ignition a lot better than the ignition model. So basically, we are capturing the variability, and we are basically providing a lot more informative information to the fire managers compared to the ignition model. So the augmented ignition model, in my opinion at least, is doing a lot better than the ignition model. Next, we wanted to dig into the driving factors. What is actually driving what we are seeing? Where are the predictions coming from, right? We use the Shapley analysis for this. This is basically a game theoretic kind of analysis that identifies the individual contribution and marginal contribution of each factor toward the predictions that the model is making. We developed 3 different models with all ignitions combined, with human ignitions only, and with natural ignitions only. What's quite fascinating is that the top 3 factors, annual temperature basically capturing climate, discovery day of year basically capturing the seasonality of fires, the national preparedness level capturing the management and how much resources are available, and fire year capturing the long-term trends, are constant between all 3 models. But what's even more fascinating is what comes after those 4 factors. For all ignitions, we have vapor pressure deficit, so atmospheric aridity, how dry and hot it is, dead fuel moisture, basically how dry the fuel is, and FIPS code is capturing the county, the spatial signature. For humans, it's the FIPS code GHM, so these are the human presence, so the spatial structure, and also the human presence, and then VPD. For naturals, the human signature go away. It's the temperature, VPD, and dead fuel moisture. So basically, the human signature is not there for natural fires, which is fascinating in itself. You might ask, why is it that we have VPD as such a low? VPD is the vapor pressure deficit, how dry, atmospheric aridity, how dry and hot the weather is at the date of ignition. Why is it so low? Because being dry and hot is not enough to start an ignition, right? There are so many days that are dry and hot, but we don't have an ignition every day. That's why the VPD is coming down in that list. But also the direction of their contribution toward an ignition is also important. If you look at the annual temperature, I'm not going to go into too much detail here, just explaining in words what these show. If we look at annual temperature, we see annual temperature, increasing annual temperature can also cause higher or lower probability of ignition. So it's not, I mean, the contribution is not unidirectional. That means the annual temperature works with other factors. The national preparedness level was quite fascinating because we expected higher national preparedness level to contribute to higher probability of an ignition because we have lower resources available. But it's working the other way around. Higher national preparedness level is contributing to lower probability of an ignition. And that we attributed to a lot of these management decisions like closing public lands, public education, and other factors that actually reduce the number of ignitions. Discovery day of year can go either way. Again, it works with other factors. The other factor that has a unidirectional contribution was VPD. Higher VPD, higher probability of ignition. So that's also fascinating just by itself. Now that we saw the driving factors, we saw the maps of ignitions, what I want to do is I want to take you on another journey. Let's select a bunch of different points in which an ignition has happened, and let's look at the daily variability of fire ignitions. We selected 13 different points. I'm going to just show one of these points to you. What we have here is the other causes is coming from here in Oregon. What we see is the probability of ignition goes up and down, up and down, up and down. That basically is capturing the up and down of weather, energy release component, dead fuel, moisture, vapor pressure deficit. These are all fire danger indices, basically showing how hot and dry it is. Wind is obviously wind. ERC percentile means compared to its location, is it high in the distribution, or is it low in the distribution of ERC? And then we have the national preparedness. Nevertheless, at the date that we had an ignition, our models predicted 52%, so that's basically above 50%. That is the threshold of ignition. So our model did a nice job there. The variability of fire ignition is capturing the variability of weather, so that's also expected. What is quite nice and quite different in this is that there are certain times in which, for example, energy release component being low means fire danger level is low, and fuel being the dead fuel moisture being high means the fuels are wet. But we still have a high probability of ignition. Part of it is wind, part of it is other factors that I'm not showing here. The day of ignition, the location, and all other factors work together in tangent in certain times of the year. They can create a probability of an ignition where the weather is not necessarily too hot and dry. And I'm not showing it here, but for certain locations, we see a fire probability being high all the time, except for a very specific period that's just too wet and too cold to have an ignition. Otherwise, where we have arson, for example, throughout the year, the probability of an ignition will remain high because the human factors dominate the weather variability in those locations. Now, so far, I presented all ignition models, human ignition models, and natural ignition models. But if our focus is targeted intervention, basically reducing the number of ignitions or preventing fires, we need to know exactly what type of an ignition will happen, because if the ignition is power started, right, you cannot, if this power started, closing public land is not going to be helpful. Or if this campfire, closing public lands is going to be important or impactful, but then shutting down power is not going to be impactful. So we really need to know what type of ignition may happen and use those targeted intervention strategies. There are three categories of intervention strategies. One of them is engineering. For example, we can put where we have high probability of campfires, we can have these fire rings, metal fire rings that basically are very effective in basically preventing fires from escaping. Behavioral interventions and public communication. You probably have seen these signs showing that, hey, do not discard your cigarette, or fireworks are prohibited, or other things. So public communication is important. Also enforcement and policy. So enforcement is basically if there is a high probability of fire, you can send fire or park rangers or police to locations that are prone to an ignition, and that has shown in the literature to be very effective in reducing the number of ignitions. With that, we went through the same modeling framework, but instead of having all fires in our model, we look at each individual cause separately. Now, what I want to draw your attention to is that the number of ignitions that we have is a lot. For example, for natural fires, we have 166,000 fires. But for some others, like for firearms or for railroad, we only have 200 or 2,600 fires or 2,200 fires. So there is that mismatch between the number of samples that are available. We also know that we have about 40 million absence of fire samples that we are using in our modeling framework. So we have 40 million absence of fire and then 2,000 presence of fire. So there is this unbalance between absence of ignition and presence of ignition. To address that unbalance, we try to use models without weight and with weight. So with weight, we are giving more weight to ignitions because we have lower number of ignitions. We are giving less weight to absence of ignition. Just keep in mind that we know that the models that we are using are tree-based. XGBoost specifically is the model that we are using in this study, and those models are robust to the unbalance of samples. So if the samples are very different, the combination of factors that create a lack of fire and the combination of factors that create a presence of fire, if this combination is clear, the model should be able to robustly capture that. And that's what you're seeing. The model without weight is actually doing generally a better job than the model with weight in our study. Another important factor that I want to draw your attention to is that the models for different fire causes gave us very different performances. For example, natural fire model was amazing. F1 score, which is capturing recall and precision at the same time, 77% F1 score is there. So that's amazing. Natural fires are quite predictable. We know where the vegetation is dry, we know the elevation, all those good stuff. There's no human behavior involved in this, so it's very well predictable. Then we have some other factors like fireworks. Although this is human started, it's still giving us a very high F1 score. This is because we know on which date. So that day of year that we have the majority of fireworks is quite known, so that the model can use to capture. Then there are other models like debris burn 36% F1 score, arson 34%. These are both, these are acceptable F1 scores because the debris burn also has that day of year that is important for it. It's the two tails of the growing season that are more conducive to debris burn. With arson, we know where arson, or we do not know, but arsons cluster in certain locations. These are arsonists, serial arsonists that are starting a lot of them. And there is copycat also in the same region. So the regional clustering is there and the model is capturing that. And then there are other factors, like there are recreation that's only 11.2%. This is just the randomness of the system. You can't really predict recreation fires because it's not just human behavior. Human behavior is there, but there's so many different factors that come together. And the same factors may lead to a fire ignition and the same factors may not lead to a fire ignition. So there is randomness in that system, and the model obviously cannot predict it too well. Now, if we look at the maps that these different fire models are generating for July 4th of 2020, importantly, you see a lot of differences between. This is the natural fires, these are the recreation started ignitions, these are the debris started ignitions, this is the fireworks ignitions. There is a lot of differences between them, so that's amazing that the model is capturing that. For the natural ignitions, they are following where the mountains are. That's expected. For the recreation, it's a subset of the mountains, so basically where the recreation happens in the mountains. And then for firearms or for fireworks, what's quite fascinating, first of all, it's capturing where the population is, but in California, we do not really have a high probability of ignition, and that is, we do not have policy in our model, but the year and the location together is capturing where the policies are coming through, and California has been pioneering in terms of policies of prevention of fires. I'm running out of time, so I'm just gonna skip over the next couple of slides. I talked about the ignition a lot. We are working on the on fuel reduction or hazardous fuel reduction as a strategy for reducing the number of ignitions. So hopefully more work will come out in the next couple of years. I just want to acknowledge the funding from Joint Fire Science Program and also to some extent National Science Foundation. The work that I presented today was entirely done by Dr. Yawar Pourmohamed, my former PhD student, now with the University of Nevada, Reno. Congratulations again to the UNU-INWEH for the 30th anniversary. And if you have any questions, please shoot me an email, or I'm happy to answer your questions here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sadegh. Very, very interesting presentation. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about some of the specific human activity patterns, that are most strongly driving this persistence. You talked about July fireworks on July 4th and COVID-19 and more yard work and cigarettes. Could you talk a little bit more about some of these human patterns and maybe some of the behavioral kind of policy interventions that you're considering or that have been identified as most effective?
Absolutely. There are, again, coming back to those fire prevention strategies, there are three general categories of fire prevention. One is engineering, and there are a variety of different ways that we can, and I know that I'm going tangent for your question, but hopefully that provides more policy answers to that question. So we have a lot of vehicle-started fires. Part of it is human behavior, and part of it is that education that if your vehicle is hot, do not just park on grasses on the side of the road, right? That's public education. But at the same time, especially in the Western US, you see a lot of these grasses are mowed down by the transportation departments. That's exactly because we know that they will start fire and the fires will cause a lot of trouble. So that becomes a policy that engineering to just mow down those grasses, make sure that that when because people are people will, whatever education we do, there are going to be one person that will not follow it and will start a fire. So we need to come up with other things, including that mow, right? Another change is a spark arrestor in cars. So a lot of sparks would come out of the exhaust in the cars and would start fires that are now not there anymore because we changed the policies, and there's no car that can be built now or be sold in the United States that doesn't have a spark arrestor. So that's engineering. Another engineering type, for example, that's happening a lot now in certain regions, like in California, is undergrounding a lot of these power lines, right? So when a lot of these destructive fires or power lines started during high windy days, and we get to the environmental conditions that prevention becomes almost impossible, right? So when prevention becomes almost impossible, in a sense that the only way is to just shut down the power in that location, because if something happens, and that ranges from a fallen tree on the power line, or it can be a down pole, or it can be a bird that is stuck between the two lines and start the fire. It can be several different things. So there is a high probability, and they'll have to shut down the power. And shutting down the power is very expensive for the people that are downstream using that power. A lot of people, for medical reasons or for other reasons, need that power, and so that public safety power shutoff that is exercised is now very costly for the community, for the society as a whole. It's less costly than a potential fire that might happen, but still very costly. So a lot of those power lines are now being undergrounded. So they're just moving them underground to remove that probability. We talked about engineering. Another factor is enforcement, right? In the U.S. specifically, the fires that are costly or deadly or along that line are investigated, right? And the people who started the fire will be held accountable for that. There was Columbia Gorge fire in 2017 in Oregon that costed $17 million in suppression costs. And they ended up investigating it, and they ended up finding that 2 Canadian kids that were camping in that region started that fire, and they were fined $17 million for the cost of that ignition. Another fire in Boise happened in the same 2016. $365,000 were the fine that a couple of kids that were just playing around and teasing one another started the fire were fined for it. So that enforcement is super important, because then you know that you're accountable for whatever damage you cause as you're doing those stuff. Just the police presence have been shown to be very effective in reducing or police or park ranger or other types of enforcement. Or now in many communities, we have the community fire watch. So people are actually volunteering their time to just go around their communities, making sure that everything is safe, because when the fire starts, it impacts everyone, right? So it's just less costly to volunteer your time to ensure fires do not happen there. And then there is communication, right? A lot of people, especially in the Western US, that we have a lot of migration, in-migration and out-migration. Specifically for in-migration, a lot of people that come in from regions that were not fire-prone may not know how serious that simple mistake is. So being able to educate them through many different factors, through HOAs, like homeowner associations have newsletters, there are community events, there are roadside signs, there are ads on TV, radio, and other things that basically educate people and make them aware that this is a big problem. Did I answer your question, Dr.? I know I went tangent and talked about a lot of other things.
No, that was fantastic. Absolutely. Really, really appreciate it. Bring some life, from our policy lens. So it gives us some ideas on the types of things that are being focused on to address some of these challenges. One question here from Dr. Nunbogu.
Thank you so much for the insightful presentation. You mentioned GDP, then GHM, which I think are macro scale. I wanted to know if income class contribute to fire ignition or augment ignition, and if there are opportunities for integrating your model into health systems, early warning interventions.
Absolutely, that's a great question. I appreciate that. Yes, income level at the family and also at the community level are important factors in determining some of these fire causes. Specifically for debris burn, a lot of the communities do not have the trash collection system, and they burn their debris. And some of that, and that becomes, I mean, when you burn your debris long enough, it will start a fire. It's like if you're doing it every season, if you're doing it every week, then it's a matter of time that the wind picks up. You're not careful because your level of awareness for the process that you're doing will reduce over time, right? So that becomes normal, that becomes a habit. You start burning. At some point, you become careless, right? So you burned it during wind and nothing happened. And you said, you know what, I've done it before. It's not going to happen. You do it, and it takes one time that the wind picks up a spark and start a fire. So yes, the income level is important, at least from a couple of different perspectives. One of them is actually debris burn. Another factor that's important, and I mean it's relevant to income but not exactly income, is crime level, right? A lot of those arson fires happen in areas that we have higher crime, crime, like violent crime rate in a certain county is highly correlated to the number of arson fires that happen in that county. Yeah, so that socioeconomic and that background information, social information, are important for fire ignitions. Now, yes, we can absolutely integrate these models into early warning systems. As a matter of fact, we have an ongoing project right now to integrate this ignition model with fire propagation model to give fire managers that information ahead of time. They can select, we will give them a fire ignition prediction map for the next week. They'll select where they think a fire ignition may happen, and then the model will propagate where the fire is, and it will give them the information on what's the number of people that are going to be impacted, what's the infrastructure that's going to be impacted, and other things. So they can decide on, first of all, requesting fire suppression resources. Fire suppression, that initial attack, that first couple of hours, first day, is critical in containing fires, because if the fire becomes large enough, couple of dozen acres, then it becomes unpreventable. Controlling that fire becomes really hard. But if you have resources available to prevent the fire from starting, and if it started, you have the resources in place to suppress it right there before it picks up, then that's going to be effective. Otherwise, if the fire becomes big, then it becomes really, really hard to manage it and to basically direct it. I mean, you cannot really suppress it during winds. You can kind of try to direct it. That's basically what's happening right now in the US.
Thank you for that. I think we have two more questions, and then we can end off. So, Miriam.
Thank you so much for another fantastic presentation, Dr. Sadeh. I have a lot of questions, but I'll limit myself to one, and I'll start with a question about the model parameters and the technical aspects, and maybe you can reflect on the policy implications as well. You started out by talking about the FIPS codes and this kind of trade-off between the information and, you know, I think it was 76% accuracy with the 4 kilometer, and then these trade-offs between reducing the size but increasing the complexity. And I guess I'm wondering if you were to focus in on certain areas, for example, like at the WUI or certain other areas that have a higher likelihood of a different number of factors, would your maps look different? And what does that mean for maybe FIPS codes and other policies? Should we have sort of smaller resolution for certain areas that have a higher likelihood of wildfire?
That's a great question. Thank you, Miriam, for that. We actually have it at certain locations at 30 meter that we are, and that's an absolute, I mean, we can have hyper resolution modeling, right? We can have it farther away from WUI at 4 kilometers, and then closer to WUI, we can do it at 30 meter resolution. And that becomes very important, specifically with 30 meter. We have done it for a certain region, and that's capturing even small roads are showing a lot higher probability of an ignition. So you see, you have an area, And then a small road that's going through that area is getting a lot higher probability than the adjacent locations. And that has a reason, because a lot of the fires have happened on those small regions. A lot of the trucks especially have these chains that are dragging, and the chains will hit the ground and hit the rocks and start to spark, that starts fire. So that actually shows, as we are looking at a 30-meter resolution. If you look at a 4-kilometer resolution, there is a high chance that we are going to miss that granularity, that spatial granularity. That's a valid point. It's in that Earth's Future paper that I cited in, that has actually the exact same title as the title of this talk. There are those final resolution models in there.
Wonderful. And last question from Martin.
Yeah, thank you. We are over time, so I keep it short. So I think this is a very important work. So do you see any government or public office are using your model, or how that is going?
Absolutely. First of all, in all these model development and everything that we have done, governmental agencies, including the National Interagency Fire Center in the US, which is located here in Boise, the Bureau of Land Management, National Park Service, and other agencies have been involved. This is a stakeholder-involved project from day one. And they're using it, and the next project that we are doing. So right now it's a model that people will have to run on their PCs. We are trying to make this a web-based model. So that next project that I told you is trying to make this even more accessible to managers for daily decision making, because having models is one thing, which we have, but making sure that the manager at the time that they need it, they can readily have access to accessible information is another. So we are trying to bridge that gap right now with the next project.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sadegh. That brings us to the end of our session today. Thank you, everyone, for joining today's science talk, and we look forward to seeing you next week. All the best, and we will see everyone soon.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Congratulations again on the 30th anniversary. Thanks for having me. Thank you. Bye.